Well, who doesn't like a good Viking story? How about a Viking story about weed? Let's get into this here. For a few years back, this was actually found whenever looked for, and shows that the Vikings actually spent a large amount of time, or a much larger amount of time, a span of 300 to 500 years at least, just at L'Anse du Meadows. But also people say that it would be real hard to grow pot in that area, and that they would have to be growing it someplace more south of that location, or brought it all the way in bulk from the old world, coming all the way across. So there's odd connections here. But you can see the Phoenician type or Viking ship that's here, and we've talked before about how maritime activities have gone back at least 165,000 years, verified by archaeology, that these people couldn't be on these Aegean islands here. It's too far to sea, to swim, to do everything, and too much of a fluke. But it didn't just happen once and they were stuck on the island. These people were going back and forth. That's in another video here, but let's get into these Vikings type of things and discuss Vikings in the New World, Vikings in America. Dispute over evidence of cannabis use by Vikings in North America. Cannabis pollen was discovered near an ancient Viking settlement in Newfoundland, and is generating differences in opinion, of course, as to whether or not the Vikings were smoking and eating weed while they explored America. Well, I've shown you before in another video where there was ancient fabrics made out of hemp going back, well, what was it, almost 16,000 years, or 16,000 BC, along with a rope piece that was made there. And I think that one dated like 18,000. Many people don't know that a lot of the ancient sails that were made for ships were made out of hemp. And of course, why would you grow the whole thing and then throw the other part out of it that is so usable as far as medicines and partying, or whatever way you want to look at it? Well, you wouldn't. And they didn't. And around every 420, or April 20th, because of its little number connection there, I try to put out a couple of videos here, but I'm not going to get with this one in this time, so I'm just going to fold it in here whenever we're coming into winter or something sometime. So be expecting it. So how did this all work here with this site? Well, discovered in the 1960s and dating to around the year 1000 AD, L'Anse du Meadows is an ancient Viking archaeological site located on the northern tip of the Great Northern Peninsula on the island of Newfoundland. This remote outpost of the ancient Norwegian Empire is the only confirmed evidence of pre-Columbian transoceanic contact, and it was named a World Heritage Site by UNESCO in 1978. I've done a few different videos showing you pre-Columbian contact in the New World, and that there's a whole lot of information, but it's not confirmed or agreed upon, of course, that there are very many archaeological findings that have been found in America, through Canada, down south, all the way in and into South America itself, Central and South America, showing you that they didn't just come in at the very top right there, and then while facing all of Canada and all of North America and beyond, they just turned around and went back. These people were spending a large amount of time here, and it looked like this was some type of jump-off settlement too. And there are people that believe that there are other sites that could be looked at and showing you this hip-hopping, skipping into North America view, but they don't want to agree upon it. Well, about 4 years ago, they came out finding another spot, not as glamorous as L'Anse du Meadows, but it was definitely a place they had been, and it wasn't back over this way. It was leading into North America. A couple of years ago, I made a video showing you that they've checked the genetics of the dogs all in Central and South America there, and they all seem to come from this Norwegian hounds and dogs that lived up to there, Chihuahuas and things along that nature. It just shows direct thing. DNA can show you sometimes things that you've been dismissed or trained to dismiss forever. This is one of the little settlements here showing you that they had fencing and stuff going on. It's believed they even brought over cattle and did things along this line. So they took it to another point here. And there were times that they believe, because they don't really see any direct evidence, that this place was abandoned and then came back to, and abandoned and came back to repeatedly. It wasn't a one-time thing in any way, but we'll get into that more as we go into it. That's the Viking settlement of L'Anse du Meadows. Traditionally, archaeologists generally agree that this site was only occupied for a brief period in the 11th century, or from the year 1000 on. But in the new paper published yesterday in the Journal Proceedings of the National Academy of Science by Paul Ledger, the lead author and postdoctoral fellow at the Memorial University of Newfoundland, suggests Vikings may have inhabited the site from the 12th or even 13th century and beyond. And in a moment we'll see that it predates the actual 1,000-year date that they started off with, spanning more than 300 years that we're looking at now, instead of a brief time that this one group maybe did something. Is looking like multi-generations did a lot of things. Controversial bog-bound ecofacts. In August 2018, a team of archaeologists excavated a peat bog almost 100 feet east of L'Anse du Meadows, so it was just right there. And according to an article in Live Science, they found a layer of ecofacts, environmental remains which might have been brought by humans, or that would pretty much have to be, that radiocarbon dated to the 12th or 13th century, again showing you this wasn't this brief thing right around the year 1000. Among these ecofacts, the archaeologists recovered caribou dung, charcoal, which they were able to help date, 2 beetles, one being Simplicara metallica from Greenland, and the other was Acidata quadrata from the Arctic area. Neither one of them supposedly from this area here. Additionally, juglin, walnut, and humulus cannabis pollen was also discovered, but neither this nut or plant grew naturally at L'Anse du Meadows, and the scientists confided that the Vikings may have collected these when they sailed south. So they indicate here that the cannabis pollen was discovered, but neither this nut or plant grew naturally here in that area. It'd have to be someplace more south. And the scientists confided that the Vikings may have collected these when they sailed south, but this would also indicate that they're making groupings of areas down south of this situation where they could grow it, and on top of that, taking it there and bringing it back and showing you a connection like that. So here's the look at those beetles here that aren't really from the area, and cannabis pollen right there on the right, and wood and charcoal that they were able to date, along with walnuts and so on, that really aren't supposed to be from the area. So, other evidence is shown. A team of scientists performed Bayesian analysis, which statistically interpreted radiocarbon dates from artifacts previously excavated at L'Anse Meadows, and this showed occupation at the site for up to 200 years before the Vikings were thought to have first arrived, which we went over before at around 1000. So in the first 1100 century or whatever, that time there, but it looks like it goes back before that time. This changes the span of this. Instead of being a one-time small occupation thing to something that repeatedly happened for apparently over 400 or 500 years, perhaps even longer. They can only find it at this point here at this one. But if we were to actually seriously look into the situation further, we might find another site which would give other datings and so on, and really just change everything again. So he tells you that this does not imply a continuous occupation, and that Vikings may have abandoned and reoccupied L'Anse du Meadows whenever required. So again, bouncing back and forth, going forward. And apparently they were bringing enough pot to where this pollen is showing up here in a pretty good amount. Now, the traces of cannabis pollen might mean Vikings grew and used cannabis for making clothes, sale costs, as I mentioned, medicines, or for just getting high when exploring the wilds of North America. But Paul Ledger says in the paper, pollen can easily be carried by the wind, and interpretations of specific find must show caution. In other words, maybe pot was grown right on in large amounts right there on the coast of the old world, and due to winds, it would blow it all the way over there. I think we can pretty much say that that's a very small chance of that being a possibility whenever they're seeing it in concentrations right here within a short period of from where it comes from. In fact, you could probably go a couple hundred yards either way and do a deep dig and see if you could find any, and you'd probably find maybe a little bit because of it being right there in concentrations. Go a little bit of ways and you wouldn't see it, and then that would show you that no, it's not some blown on the wind type idea for sure. And there's some pot. So they're saying it might mean Vikings used it, or it could have been transported by the wind. It must have been tempting to have concluded that the Vikings grew weed at L'Anse du Meadows, considering a December 2017 Ancient Origins article, which discusses a research paper on the portal Foskening. Archaeologists discover an isolated Iron Age farm in southern Norway, at which traces of cannabis were found dating between the years 650 and 800 AD, i.e. the beginning of the Viking Age, proved they certainly did use weed. Well, yeah, from their origins and stuff going there. And then, of course, they're Proto-Europeans, and we've seen stuff going back tens of thousands of years where they used to be before that. You see, because all this Danish lands and Norway and things like that were under a continental ice shelf for most of the time that we think of. Anyhow, however, just because the Vikings grew cannabis in ancient Norway, it'd be wrong to assume, therefore, that a group of explorers grew it in North America. And this is why the new study claims to pose more questions than answers. This is calculated and safe stance to take, because while these researchers are celebrating the publication of their results, as a raft of more skeptical scientists suggest the ecofacts could have been brought to the bog, not by the Vikings, but by the indigenous culture of Newfoundland, that somehow they could have come over and gotten these going. Yeah, so instantly they've got to go with all of the possibility of thoughts, but I think one can easily see that whenever we just look at the possibility of what this really means, it shows you that they were doing it. And it would be much more viable for them to be growing it in a more southern location than L'Anse du Meadows than it would be to say it come all the way across in a large amount. But both are equally as possible. Brigitta Wallace is a senior archaeologist emeritus with Parks Canada, and she told Live Sciences that she is convinced the Vikings left behind these ecofacts because no evidence has been found suggesting they returned in the 12th and 13th centuries. That's strange. There just came out a paper that's already peer-reviewed, and they say, yeah, so it went on much longer. There were people that came back and forth enough times and lasted through this point. What do we know, or what we do know, says Wallace, is that there were indigenous people, ancestors of Bothok, on the site at that time. Yes, they also lived near from there, but from my understanding, weed wasn't growing anywhere that they could have had attachments to it. So because we see the Vikings and we see the weed, that's just a double confirmation. Not that they both came all the way over and got weed and went back. I'm sure it's a possibility in some people's mind right now, but I think we can go with the Occam's razor on this one And if we do, it just makes so much more sense than the idea that the Bothok barbarians somehow came all the way across and gotten this weed. The Bothok people formed around 1500 BC, and about 1000 AD, the first Norse explorers recorded encounters with natives in northern Newfoundland, which they called Skraelings, or barbarians, whom they drove inland. Latterly, the Bothok revisited their former tradition hunting camps for metal tools, parts of shelter, building materials left by the European fishermen. Here's the depiction of what the Bothoks look like, but of course, that's a skin boat there, and then the place that they're in is a Caucasian type of building thing that's shown here, so it's a little different than that concept, but they were the indigenous people that were all in Newfoundland and northern Canada, if you will, and so on. An article in Heritage Newfoundland and Labrador says the Bothok's main food sources had traditionally been caribou, fish, and seals, but there were forced migration inland led to the overhunting of caribou in that area and a decrease in the population in Newfoundland. Being forced from their traditional territories and lifestyle and new ecosystems, unable to support them, caused widespread malnourishment and starvation, which led to their extinction. Oh yeah, you see, you've got to take a twist here at the end of it and say white man bad, and we just did something like that. It doesn't look like smallpox affected them or anything like that went on here, but the fact that they just were run a little more inland, well, they can be run inland, but from my understanding, that coast there is pocketed with all kinds of islands and inlets and so on, so you could just move a couple of hundred one direction or another and not really have the problem. Not that you would be driven inland, and if you wanted to be on the coast, you wouldn't be driven anywhere but just down or up the coast. Anyhow, let me know what you think about this showing here. It's just one more connection that shows that the Vikings were more in depth in the Americas than people want to ever give credit to. And it's strange, it shows a connection to cannabis and so on too that we talk about sometimes, but that's one way of tracing it. That's one way of seeing things. If somebody saw a cannabis fabric piece, it would also have to be showing something. But not only is this like just some little piece of info here, there are so many artifacts that have been found in the Americas that have ancient Phoenician writing, which at first they were touting and thought it was great with ancient Hebrew writing, but then people looked at it and said, this is Phoenician, that's where that Hebrew dialect thing came from, just like Greece took that, so that's where this comes from, and everybody went silent over it. It was great if it went with the Bible, though, because people back then were trying to think that any way they could account for all the different people on earth is somehow coming out of Noah's boat, which is another impossibility, but for another video. Anyhow, showing that and showing the idea that the dogs that are in South America and Central America and so on are directly from these type of people, along with so many mounds, artifacts being found in cultures, it shows that they had a much deeper response into the Northern America continent, and it looks like they went to Central and perhaps even South America. When you hear the story of Viracocha and a bearded man, and none of the Amerindians had beards or so on, it comes across as showing you something in their mythology that says something like this happened too. But that's for another video also. Anyhow, let me know what you think down below. Peace.